All right, AP Gov people, we have video number 9 for you in our continuing series of breaking down the AP Gov curriculum. This one is on public opinion. Everything you need to know about public opinion to succeed in AP Gov. All right, let's start off talking about what the heck is public opinion. It is how the public views certain issues, events, people, etc. Basically, it is the thoughts and ideas of the public towards an issue. And how is it measured? It is done so via polls, which take a sample of the population and then can project that out to the nation as a whole. Public opinion polls, very important when it comes to elections, especially presidential elections. Okay, let's talk about this dude, George Gallup. He really began the practice of polling in America during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. So how are polls administered? They take a sample of the population, and in some cases as little as 1,000 people, then they project those numbers out to the nation as a whole. You need to know these characteristics of effective polls. I've seen it on release exams before. Be familiar with them. Number one, random sampling. What this means is they just randomly select people. This is important to ensure accuracy by ensuring that you get a different group of people. Two, just as important, it has to be a representative sample. In other words, these random samplings that you take should reflect society as a whole. So what that means is just over 50% of the random sampling should include women, and roughly 13% of the respondents should be black as well. So if you're truly randomly sampling people and it's a representative sample, the percentages of groups of people for the nation as a whole should be the same for a poll. You also need a large sample size with a low margin of error, around 3% margin of error, and a large sample size, 1,000, 1,500 people or so. And number four, the wording of the question should be unbiased or not leading. So an example of this is, how would you rate the president's job performance? That's not nearly as leading of a question as, do you agree with most Americans that the president is doing a poor job? That kind of sets in your mind that the president, the assumption is that the president is doing a bad job, and you would probably be more likely to respond with a yes. So the wording of the question is very, very important. So how accurate are polls? Well, I mentioned that 3% margin of error, but really, polls are pretty darn accurate within 3%. And this is known as sampling error. What this means is if a poll states that 50% of the population approves of the job the president is doing, it could be as low as 47, that's -3, or as high as 53 plus 3. So a 3% error could go either way. Usually the larger the poll audience, the smaller the margin of error. That's why it's important to get a large group of people, because the margin of error decreases. So let's talk about the positives of polls. Well, they can help politicians determine what is important to the public. If politicians want to know how their constituents feel about something, they could just look at a poll. It's also a way for them to stay in touch with their constituents and their ideas. There are criticisms of polls, including that some argue politicians are too influenced by polls. You're doing too much poll watching, and you're being more of a follower or a reactionary, or you're reacting too much to polls and you're not necessarily a leader. Polls may create a bandwagon effect, which used to be a real thing where people would hop on a bandwagon during a campaign. And here's a reenactment of an old bandwagon. If a poll reveals that many people are voting for a certain politician, that may encourage more people to vote for them. And exit polls, these are used on election day, and these are criticized because candidates are declared winners, even though on the West Coast in like California, Oregon, Portland, even though people are still voting there, polls have concluded that a candidate has won, and that could discourage people from going out and voting. And again, as I mentioned, with the bias and the wording of the question, the wording can really change the response of individuals. So depending on the way the question is asked, it could influence a person's response. So what do polls reveal about Americans? Well, many Americans have a disconnect with politics. Less than 50% can identify their representative in the House. Can you identify yours? I'll tell you mine. Mine is this dude, Brian Higgins. He has been a representative for quite a while. So I am in the minority of Americans that can identify my member of the House. Since the 1970s, especially with Watergate, we talked about this in the last video, Americans trust in government has decreased significantly. So polls reveal that Americans really don't trust their government. And again, a lot of it goes back to the 60s and 70s. The lone exception is after 9/11 when that increased, but it really went back to low levels shortly after. And many Americans are weary of big government. So let's do a quick recap. We have public opinion. What is it? How is it measured? Also know the characteristics of effective polls, be able to identify and explain all four of them, and positives and negatives of polls, as well as Americans' beliefs as shown through polls. What does it tell us? All right, for test tips, please be able to identify characteristics of effective polling. You can see a question such as all the following are examples of effective polling except, and be able to identify criticisms of polling as well. For free response, the 2011 free response, part of it was on public opinion in Congress and effective characteristics of effective polling. So make sure you know that. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you right back here for video 10, participation in politics, when we'll talk about this gentleman, Martin Luther King Jr. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below. I thank you for watching and have a good day.